Hi everyone, welcome back. It's week 5 of program evaluation and outcomes management, and we're finally going to start getting into outcomes measurement. We're also going to take some time at the end, don't worry, and we're going to go through some of what you can predict for next week's midterm. Last week, we navigated the importance of assessing a program's implementation. Even with a strong foundation, where the program targets an evidenced need and is based on strong underlying program theory and a good service delivery model, it can fail at the implementation stage. When a program is launched, it is particularly vulnerable. This is when the planning hits the ground, when the program is launched, and the program may not be delivered in a manner that aligns with how it was specified, both for intentional and unintentional reasons, some of which could include the program may not reach the intended population, or the intended population may not engage with it. There may be resource limitations. The program may experience drift over time. Programs with an educational component may not adhere to the program curriculum. There may be unforeseen barriers to access or delivery. People may drop out of the program, or the program may underserve the target population and overserve those who are not members of the target population. Assessing a program's implementation, or how well the program is aligning with how it was intended to run. Evaluators can identify areas of strength and areas for improvement, and ideally bring forward any concerns earlier rather than later to attempt to reduce the issues. Knowing that a program is running as closely as possible to how it was designed also positions the evaluator to take on the next evaluative stage, measuring the outcomes. This is where we're going to focus today, and we're going to focus after the midterm. As we've been doing, I'd just like to take a moment to situate where we are in terms of the various types of evaluations we're talking about. When we're looking at the various evaluative processes that can be undertaken to examine social needs and corresponding social programs, we're at the point where the program is running, and now we're starting to answer the question of does it work? While with program implementation evaluations, which we discussed last week, we're looking at how well a program made the jump from paper to practice, impact evaluations are concerned with what happens after. How well did the well-implemented program perform? That begs the question of how we measure such concepts of success. Similar to monitoring the implementation and processes of a program through its life cycle, measuring the outcomes of a program is also rarely a standalone, one-time only task. Indeed, sometimes it can be part of a feedback loop and be captured in the process evaluations we spoke of last week. This is one example of how our simplified linear process depicted here is not always so straightforward and not always just moving from one step to the other. Just like how issues with program implementation may suggest areas of the program theory that are not adequate, so too can the outcomes start to indicate potential areas for refinement in the program implementation or delivery. While the goal is to move forward, so that we're ideally starting to see the meeting of the identified social need area, we don't do our evaluations and then put them in a box to file away. The results that the evaluator is seeing should be used to make the program better, to inform modifications or needed revisions, or in really extreme cases, possibly indicate it's time to stop or discontinue the program due to faults that are resulting in unintended negative impacts. To be clear, a program outcome is the characteristic we are trying to change through the program's interventions. Some examples might be attitudes towards violence for an intimate partner violence program, incidents of smoking for an anti-smoking program, criminal recidivism or reoffending for an antisocial behaviors program for those convicted of criminal offenses, school-aged hunger and food insecurity for a breakfast program offered at a local elementary school in a lower-income neighborhood, senior citizen digital literacy for an educational and experiential program that intends to assist seniors with learning and becoming comfortable with computers, smartphones, and other technologies. Immigrant underemployment for a policy-based program seeking to assist newcomers to Canada with finding career opportunities that reflect their experience and education from their country of origin. Community incidents of impaired driving for an anti-drug driving media-based awareness campaign. Or low-income access to higher education for a program seeking to assist in reducing barriers to post-secondary education. When people think of evaluating a program, the program outcomes are often what will come to mind first. It's the most glamorous, if you will, evaluation because it gets right at the target of what the whole point of delivering and developing the program was, making a positive change in the need area experienced by the target population. It's also the most critical evaluation task because it's going to answer the main question asked of any program by almost every stakeholder involved. Does it work? Outcomes can be defined as the state of the target population or the social conditions with which a program intervenes on a characteristic or behavior the program might potentially affect. The outcomes would still exist in theory even if a program didn't occur. It's essentially any social condition that could change and that we can measure that change. The program becomes the tool to influence that change, and the evaluator is interested in the role of the program in bringing about the change. To unpack this a bit further, the outcome is pointing to the change in the social need. The program itself offers many interventions, but it is not the outcome itself. Thus, program outcomes are observable characteristics of the target population or of the social conditions. They are not characteristics of the program. And if you look at the definition of an outcome, it doesn't reference the actions of the program or the interventions of the program at all. Rather, these services provided by the program are referred to as the outputs of the program. These are the services provided by a program or received by participants. These two should not be confused. The outputs of the program will contribute to the program's outcomes, but they are very different concepts. Additionally, the concept of an outcome does not necessarily mean that there has been any actual change on that outcome or that any change that has occurred was caused by the program rather than by some other influence. Remember, a program is designed to bring about change and will have defined one or more outcomes of interest. However, despite the intervention, there is no guarantee that there will be change produced. Or, if there is change, there's no guarantee that it was the result of the program. There may have been additional external interventions at work or natural changes in the target population that may have produced the changes. This increases the complexity of the work of the evaluator. For example, we may have a program that seeks to reduce the incidence of impaired driving. Perhaps our baseline data to compare against was from 2019, and we were going to run the program for the 2020 calendar year, completing our outcome evaluation in early 2021. Given that our program theory assessment and implementation evaluation indicated that the program should perform well, it would be reasonable to expect to see a decrease in impaired driving occurrences. However, the pandemic came in unexpectedly, imposing social and travel restrictions that would naturally reduce the volume of traffic and thus the opportunity for impaired driving. Teasing this apart is key, since it's obvious that the program may not be entirely responsible for any changes seen. While this is a fairly straightforward example, it does serve to showcase the importance of recognizing alternate explanations for the outcomes observed and the effect of those confounding variables. Connecting the dots a bit here, last week we discussed the process and implementation evaluation, which was concerned with the alignment of the program to its intended process theory. Impact or outcome evaluations are, in comparison, operating in the domain of the impact theory, the theory of change that underlies the program, as it predicts that the interventions offered will bring about the intended change in the social condition. When discussing outcomes, there are three concepts that we need to become familiarized before we move forward. The first is the outcome level. And this is the status of an outcome at some point in time. This could refer to the prevalence of, say, impaired driving in our community. Generally, this measure is taken prior to the program's implementation, and at this point, has nothing to do with the program. The second concept is the outcome change. This is the difference between outcome levels from one point in time to another. So, say, increased or decreased frequency of impaired driving occurrences over a 365-day time frame. Often this measure will be taken after a program, if one is running, but it could be a secondary measure without any intervention. The third concept is the program effect, and this is the difference between the outcome level for those exposed to the program and the outcome level they would have had if they had not been exposed to the program. It is the change on the outcome experienced by program participants that can be attributed directly and uniquely to the effects of the program as opposed to the influence of other factors. The program effect, in other words, seeks to describe the change that the program brought about, isolated from the change that would have been expected otherwise. This is the change that can be attributable to the program itself. This allows the evaluator to give a judgment on the success of the program. If the outcome is the same or worse than what would have happened without the program, it will likely be classified as a neutral or negative result. This is what we're talking about when we speak of program impact, and it represents the value add that the program contributed to the change in the social condition. Just as with other types of analyses, eliciting the program effects can be demanding and complex. While the visualization on the slide, which is taken from your textbook, aptly describes the area of focus for the impact evaluator, this estimation of the program effects is possibly the most methodologically complex form of evaluation that the evaluator may undertake. While an evaluator may be able to take pre- and post-program measures for the individuals who received the program's interventions, they need to be able to estimate what the outcome would have been without the program. We'll be going to be covering how evaluators can approach making these inferences in the next few classes and in the next few textbook chapters. So let's talk about identifying relevant outcomes. Sometimes the program outcomes will be easy to identify. This is often the case for more straightforward programs. Some programs may only have one or two fairly intuitive outcomes, while others may have greater complexity, which may differ by different subgroups within the target population. For example, we might expect different outcomes by gender, age, marital status, etc. Regardless, just like with any phase of evaluation that we've talked about so far, being specific and taking time to carefully define these outcomes sets the evaluation up to be focused, clear, and readily communicated to the stakeholders, with everyone having a shared understanding of what was examined. And so, just like so many previous tasks that we've talked about, establishing what the outcomes are is rarely completed by the evaluator without input from the program's stakeholders. Assume at this point that very few decisions about an evaluation are made without the input of at least a few key stakeholders who have a specific interest and specific vision for what the evaluation needs to tell them. Gathering the perspective of the stakeholders should be your first step to identifying the measures of program outcomes that you'll use. This is because various program stakeholders will have their own understandings of what the program is supposed to accomplish, and correspondingly what outcomes they expect it to affect. Similarly, different stakeholders will have different perspectives on what they need in terms of information about how well the program is working. At this stage, the information may already be in the stated objectives, goals, and missions of the program, and possibly captured in the previous work that the evaluator may have done eliciting the program theory and assessing the program's implementation. Additional sources of this information may be in funder proposals or the contract for services for the program. That said, a challenge that the evaluator will often experience is that the outcomes are not articulately, concretely specified enough for the evaluator to be able to clearly and accurately identify and then define them. When this is the case, the evaluator will need to try to craft these definitions, refining them by possibly engaging with the stakeholders to elicit more details. Ultimately, the evaluator is seeking definitions that reflect the targets that the program intends to change and that are highly specific and avoid generalities and ambiguities. It is vital that this work be done. The definitions of the outcomes will direct the evaluation. You need to be sure that you are measuring the intended outcomes and that these are defined by the shared understanding and contributions of the stakeholders to whom you will be reporting back to. Building on identifying what your outcomes will be. We referenced earlier that outcome evaluations are in part highly aligned with the impact theory that is specified in a program theory. Recall that the impact theory is the program's theory of change, what the program is targeting for change and how it intends to bring about that change. This impact theory can be a good source for identifying the outcomes to measure. Given that a logic model was used, it should pattern out what is expected to change, both short-term and long-term, by connecting the program's activities to the short and long-term outcomes. This series of assumptions and effects should be a priority source for the evaluator who is doing the work to identify and define the outcomes of interest for an impact evaluation. The short-term or proximal outcomes are rarely the ultimate outcomes of the program. They're rarely what the program ultimately intends to influence. However, this does not mean that they should be overlooked in any evaluation. These can represent the quick wins and the takeaways from the program. In addition, the proximal outcomes are generally the easiest to measure and the easiest to assess for program effects. If the program is successful at influencing these outcomes, it is appropriate for it to receive credit for doing so. This will often represent changes that are psychological, such as attitudes, behaviors, knowledge, awareness, motivation, etc., or short-term changes in behaviors. However, like I said, the short-term gains are often not the ultimate goal of the program. The more distal outcomes, which may be more difficult to measure, are also typically the ones most difficult to assess for program effects. Impact evaluation estimates of program effects on the distal outcomes will be more balanced and interpretable if information is also available for the effects on the proximal outcomes. Ultimately, the distal outcomes or the long-term outcomes will be the most useful for practical application and policy generation. That said, the distal outcomes are also the most outside of the program's direct influence. As the further along in the timeline post-program, the more likely it is that outside influences will also impact those long-term outcomes. All this to say, evaluators need to be ready to look at both the short-term and long-term outcomes to provide a fulsome and balanced report back on the program's level of success. Given the systematic and often academic approach that evaluators employ, It is perhaps unsurprising that prior research can also be a valuable source of information when attempting to identify and define relevant outcomes to assess. Of particular relevance will be evaluation research on similar programs. Learning which outcomes have been examined in other studies may assist in identifying outcomes that the evaluator hadn't thought of. It can also be very helpful to look at how similar outcomes were articulated and measured, as that can help the evaluator come up with strong conceptualizations for their current evaluation. In some cases, you get lucky even, and you find relatively standard definitions and measures that, if adopted for the current evaluation, would allow direct comparisons of the evaluation results with those reported for other programs. In other cases, it can illuminate issues with certain ways of defining some outcome, which can help the evaluator avoid similar erroneous definitions. Of course, while the strategies so far do a good job for assisting in identifying the intended outcomes of a program, there's always the potential for unintended outcomes. These can be positive or negative impacts on the targeted need and are far more difficult for the evaluation to isolate and define, since they were never anticipated to begin with by stakeholders and program developers. These effects become distinctive because they emerge through some process that is not part of the program's design and direct intent. By their very nature, unintended outcomes are difficult for the evaluator to anticipate. That said, despite the difficulty that the evaluator may have in identifying them, they should not be ignored. Understanding whether there are unintended outcomes and how they may have impacted the program is important for the overall assessment of the program's outcomes. An easy example of this is with property crime. So let's say break-in enters to residences, vandalism, thefts from motor vehicles, etc. It is recognized that often programs to help community members reduce their likelihood of having their residential or business property victimized by thieves can achieve that goal. But it's often at an unintended consequence. And that unintended consequence can be that would-be offenders may just move their activities to a different neighborhood, thus displacing the problem rather than truly solving it. One way to gain insight into potential unintended outcomes is to consult previous research and evaluations of similar programs. Or the evaluator may consider talking with people who are in the position to observe any unanticipated effects of the program. This may involve program facilitators, case managers, and others who are directly in contact with the program and the target population accessing the program. This lens into the program relies on the relationships that the evaluator has built with the program staff and should be a good reminder of the importance of developing and maintaining meaningful contact with program personnel at all levels of the program. You never know when they're going to be helpful and be able to provide insight that you won't be able to necessarily find or capture otherwise. Once you've established what the outcomes are and how they will be defined, You move into decisions relating to the prioritization and restricting the scope of the outcomes evaluation as a whole. Indeed, not every outcome identified will be of equal importance or relevance, so the evaluator does not necessarily need to measure all of them in order to conduct an evaluation. Some prioritization and selection may be appropriate. Notably, the very long-term outcomes just may not be feasible. The evaluator may be better off reserving those for a recommendation of next steps rather than attempting to measure something that has yet to have time to come to fruition. The evaluator may need to pare down the list of outcomes to be measured, and may do this by consulting with the stakeholders, examining the feasibility of measuring the outcomes, and examining the relevance of the outcome against what the program, at its heart, was attempting to do. Once the relevant outcomes have been chosen and a full and careful description or definition of each is in hand, the evaluator must face the issue of how to actually measure them. Outcome measurement is a matter of representing the circumstances defined as the outcome by means of observable indicators that vary systematically with the changes or differences in those circumstances. In other words, an outcome will be measured by identifying specific indicators that are expected to respond to the intervention, and that the variances will be systematic and related to the change in the circumstances. At its simplest, we are looking at the one-dimensional indicators that tell us whether something is happening or not. Our textbook gives us a good example of one of these one-dimensional outcomes. If an industrial safety program is looking to impact safe workplace practices, one outcome indicator could be whether the workers are wearing their safety goggles in the workplace. This is a fairly simple binary measure that is tangible enough that it doesn't really need that much in-depth look to be able to figure out how you might measure that. However, in reality, most outcomes, especially with social indicators, are multidimensional. By this, we mean that they have various components that may form the whole concept, and the evaluator will need to look at as many as possible to have a comprehensive measure. Perhaps we are examining a program that aims to increase seniors' digital literacy. An outcome may be confidence using a smartphone. But this opens the door to multiple indicators that could collectively indicate this concept. We might look at the frequency of use of the smartphone. We might look at the type of use or the complexity of the tasks that they're doing. You might have to measure multiple facets of the concept to get the overall measurement. As such, the evaluator generally should think about outcomes as comprehensively as possible to ensure that no important dimensions are overlooked. An added bonus to this approach is that it helps to mitigate the impact that a poorly performing measurement may have. If you use a single measurement to determine the success of a particular outcome, you risk that the program may perform poorly on that measure. But the program could actually be doing well if multiple dimensions tapping into the same concept were included. It's similar to the idea of triangulating your data sources so that you have a well-rounded measure of the concept. Multiple measures can provide broader and more comprehensive insights into the concept and allow the strengths on one measure to compensate or balance out the weaknesses that may be shown in another. The evaluator will still want to be strategic. as it can quickly turn into an overwhelming set of measures. Similar to what we were just saying, it's advisable to prioritize what those outcomes will be and then prioritize what the measures of that outcome will be. So, you've determined what your outcomes may be, and you've prioritized which are the most relevant and important to the evaluation. Next, you're going to want to look more closely at how exactly you will measure them. There's a few basic sources that can give us our data: observations, records, responses to interviews and questionnaires, standardized tests, physical measurements, etc. The information from such sources becomes measurement when it's operationalized. That is, generated through a set of specified systematic operations or procedures. Operationalization is a key strategy in the social sciences, where we take broader, more abstract concepts and specify how we are going to quantify them. The social sciences have to take this step because often our concepts are not particularly technical. While, say, a scientist in the medical field can measure, say, blood pressure or lung capacity or height or weight or other concepts that lend themselves easily to how they're going to be measured, social scientists are often attempting to quantify and measure concepts such as community engagement or social cohesion or attitudes or motivations to change or social anxiety or even hunger, which are less easily measured, or at least they're less intuitively measured. Sometimes operationalization of a concept is already standardized, say by extant research literature or by governing or regulatory bodies. This is particularly true for the more long-term outcomes that impact policy and decision making, and in fields such as healthcare, clinical psychology, etc. Still, sometimes a ready-made measurement will not suffice. It may not capture the nuances or perspectives that is needed for the particular program at hand. In such cases, where there is no standard measure or the measure is not adequate for the task, the evaluator may need to deviate from the standard method of measuring due to the nature of the program. Some just do not have an overall consensus on how it should be measured. In such cases where a standardized approach to operationalization is not available, which is in a lot of the social science domain, the evaluator is tasked to make the best selection from the options and data sources available. Operationalization then defines how you, as the evaluator, are going to systematically measure a concept that does not lend itself well to measurement. For example, let's go back to our smartphone example, and let's use an indicator of confidence or a concept of confidence using the smartphone. Well, this could be measured through self-reported frequency and duration of use, extraction of phone usage metrics, questionnaires tapping into various dimensions that reflect the concept. We might observe the cell phone usage and observe and rank the complexity of the tasks being completed. You may use one or more measures to tap into measuring the concept. At the end of the day, the most important thing to keep in mind is that that measurement matches what the evaluator wants or needs to measure. Generally, to do a good job at developing a new measurement instrument, it's going to take time, and rarely is this time planned for in the stakeholders' timeline to have the outcome evaluation completed. In such cases, sometimes you have to do the best you can with what you have and be sure to document any caveats or limitations to go along with your results and your interpretations in your report. So the next piece is going to be familiar to many of you who come from a research background. And I just want to make sure we go through with that or go through these concepts to ensure that we're approaching them with the hat of a social scientist, because sometimes how social scientists have to use these somewhat standard terms is a little bit different than how other disciplines might approach them. So when a measurement instrument is being developed, there are three key measurement properties that are tested for to ensure that it is a sound tool to use and that the respective measures will perform well for the situation in which they will be applied. Unfortunately, when there's not time to do such a thorough job, noting that these have not been tested for can help to contextualize the results. The three properties are reliability, validity, and sensitivity. So let's start with reliability. It's the extent to which the measure produces the same results when used repeatedly to measure something that has not changed. Variation in the results constitutes measurement error. Different types of measures have been found to have differing expectations of reliability. For example, generally measurements for physical characteristics such as height, weight, blood pressure, generally these will be more reliable than social or psychological characteristics such as intelligence, poverty, spirituality, fear. Measurement unreliability impacts results by diluting, hiding, or confounding the real differences that we are trying to measure. Say we have a really strong program that has brought about significant effects as intended. If our measures are unreliable, it may appear less effective than it is. By having reliable measures and multiple measures, we can sift through the effects and variations and figure out which ones are due to chance and figure out which ones are actually attributed to the program. For evaluators, a major source of unreliability lies in the nature of measurement instruments that are based on participants' responses to written or oral questions posed by researchers. In such situations, reliability implies that two individuals whose outcomes are the same would be assigned the same value on the outcome measure, and individuals whose outcomes are different would be assigned different values on the outcomes measure. Differences in testing or measuring situations, observer or interviewer differences in the administration of the measure, and variation in the respondent's recall or engagement in the measurement process will contribute to unreliability. The most straightforward way for the evaluator to check the reliability of a candidate outcome measure is to administer it at least twice under circumstances when the outcome should not change in between. Technically, the conventional index of this test-retest reliability is a statistic known as the product moment correlation between the two sets of scores, which varies between 0.0 and 1, or 0 and 1. While this is best practice, it is often difficult because there may be natural changes that occur between the first test and the retest. This will change the product moment correlation, but is not actually related to the measurement. The next measurement property that evaluators must be concerned with is validity. Many of you are going to be familiar with this. It refers to the extent to which we are measuring what we intended to measure. Determining validity is more difficult than determining reliability. For example, we may use police statistics on the number of people ticketed for speeding in school zones. The validity of that measure may be reduced because it could reflect police practices. Perhaps manpower is down and there was little police presence at some time points. Or perhaps enforcement initiatives were targeting seatbelts rather than speeding, meaning even those who were speeding may not have been pulled over. Or perhaps it will reflect police discretion, where police have the option of issuing a warning rather than a ticket. While at the beginning, the idea of using police issued tickets as a measure for the prevalence of speeding seemed good, upon further inspection, we can see that we may not be measuring what we think we are measuring. The concept of validity usually makes good sense, but testing whether a measure is valid for a particular concept is usually difficult. While you may have come across various forms of validity in other disciplines or even within the social sciences, when it comes to evaluation processes, validity generally defaults to face validity, meaning whether a measure is accepted as valid by the appropriate stakeholders. And it certainly isn't the most scientific approach. However, if it is meaningful to those who are closest to the program, it can hold enough weight for what its purpose is in the outcome evaluations. A strategy to strengthen this is to use multiple measures of an outcome. Again, this can help offset if a particular measure's validity is not spot on. The last of the three measurement properties that we are concerned with is sensitivity, which refers to the extent to which the values on the measure change when there is a change or difference in the thing being measured. Since program outcome evaluations are all about measuring changes in the outcomes and their relation to the program, we need to be able to accurately detect these changes. Thus, our measures need to be sensitive to the changes we are hoping to see. The book gives a nice example of a finely calibrated scale, and that's how I've often thought of sensitivity. The better the tool is at capturing the big and small changes, the more sensitive it is. In an outcome evaluation, there are two main ways in which our outcome measures can be insensitive to the changes or differences of magnitude that the program might produce. First, The measure may include elements that relate to something other than what the program could reasonably be expected to change. This muddies the waters and asks for a measurement for something that is not feasible in our program. It can dilute the parts we are actually trying to measure, and it can reduce the overall response of our measure. Second, outcome measures may be insensitive to the kinds of changes or differences induced by programs when they have been developed largely for diagnostic purposes. That is, to detect individual differences. Because they are meant to test the individual, when applied to groups, they often do not perform well. If the group's pre-program scores show that the group is comprised of very different individuals, then the post scores are going to struggle to show any increment of improvement. When we are interested in the group effects, highly individualized measures can add noise and clutter to the analysis. All is not lost with that. Later in the course, we will discuss some methods that the evaluator can use to combat these issues should they arise. Your choice in outcome measures is incredibly important to the success and your ability to be able to complete an accurate and effective program impact evaluation. A poorly conceptualized outcome measure may not properly represent the goals and objectives of the program being evaluated, leading to questions about the validity of the measure. An unreliable or insufficiently sensitive outcome measure is likely to underestimate the effectiveness of a program and lead to incorrect conclusions about its impact. Basically, the takeaway is to spend as much time and resource as you can to develop and test your outcome measures. Since it's the foundational component for the outcome evaluation, spending the time to do this part well sets the evaluation up. And comparatively, fast-tracking this piece can have consequences that can compromise the entire evaluation and misrepresent the program. With adequate measures of significant program outcomes in hand, they can be used in various ways by evaluators or program managers to learn something about the performance of the program. The simplest application is outcome monitoring, defined as the regular measurement and reporting of indicators of the status of individuals or social conditions with which the program has intervened. Outcome monitoring is somewhat similar to what we discussed last week regarding process monitoring. The main difference here is that we're not looking at keeping tabs on the program's implementation and process, but rather the outcomes that we're seeing along the way as the program plays out. Outcome monitoring requires that measures be identified for important program outcomes, and these need to be practical to collect routinely and informative with regards to the performance of the program. If the outcome measurement approaches are too complex, too resource intensive, or too lofty, they won't be practical for routine, regular measurements. It's a tricky balance, though, because simpler measurements don't allow us to identify changes in outcomes or changes specifically related to the program effects. That said, ongoing outcome monitoring can provide useful information that can assist at the very least with the program's delivery. The outcome measures that serve as indicators for use in outcome monitoring schemes should be as responsive as possible to program influences. This is because we are looking for those finite changes that are suggesting that the program is having an effect. These may not be the grand results yet. Some of the most easily accessed data, such as census data, may not do the job well because it will include people who were not part of the target population and who did not receive the intervention from the program. As we discussed earlier, this impacts the sensitivity as it dilutes the data that may suggest change is happening. The most interpretable outcome indicators are those that involve characteristics or behaviors that only the program is likely to have affected to any appreciable degree. This may mean getting creative, but if you can narrow down the data to be used for the measure so that its scope is more closely aligned with the change that the program is making, it can provide some very useful insights. Client satisfaction surveys can also be helpful in the monitoring of program outcomes. While not necessarily as objective, it can help to have feedback from participants about whether they believe the program is helping them in the manner intended. Program satisfaction should not be underestimated as an outcome in and of itself. One important consideration is that any outcome indicator to which a program funder or other influential decision maker might give serious attention to will also inevitably receive emphasis from the program staff and managers. If the outcome indicators are not appropriate or fail to cover important outcomes, efforts to improve the performance they reflect may actually distort the program activities. In other words, if an indicator is known to the program administrators, naturally they will want to score well on it. They may give extra emphasis to this area of the program to match what the indicator is looking at. But if the indicator doesn't actually cover important outcomes, it can distort the program activities, potentially compromising the program fidelity or the adherence to the service delivery framework. By trying to score well on a faulty indicator, it can actually damage the program. A related problem is the corruptibility of indicators. This refers to the natural tendency for those whose performance is being evaluated to attempt to skew the indicators in a favorable direction. Sometimes there is enough internal or external pressure on the program to perform that intentionally or unintentionally, the internal integrity of the program can be compromised in order to try to show that it is performing as expected or as required. Lastly, another potential pitfall has to do with the interpretation of the outcome indicator data. Given a range of factors other than program performance that may influence those indicators, interpretations made out of context can be misleading, and even with proper context can be difficult. This is where we start to realize that not only are we trying to tap into an appropriate and accurate measurements regarding program outcomes, but this information will build the story that we as the evaluators tell. Our interpretation can take the best executed evaluation and still fail to provide an accurate portrayal of what I call the good and the bad and the ugly, all of which we have a duty to accurately portray to the stakeholders who have requested our services. The interpretation of the ongoing outcome monitoring data can be a spot of vulnerability for an outcome evaluation. Outcome data collected through routine outcome monitoring can be especially difficult to interpret if not accompanied by information about changes in client mix, relevant demographic and local trends, and other contextual information. Programs that operate over a significant period of time or involve a complex target population can be difficult to be packaged up because even if you're looking at the same indicators at each check-in, there can be notable differences within the population accessing the services or other details. Each check-in for outcome monitoring is capturing a snapshot of the population, the community being served, the resources available, etc., from time period to time period. Seeing rises and falls and changes to patterns reflects the natural course of a program operating in its ever-shifting social and political environment. Contextualizing outcome measurements against this environment and cross-referencing the measures from the process monitoring side of the house can help to paint the overall picture of how well a program is doing in light of the changes it is having to adapt and react to. This brings us to the end of week 5's content. And as we move through the last 2 slides, we're going to take a look at getting ready for the midterm and also talking about your 3rd application assignment. So this coming week, the week before your study week, is going to be your midterm. There will be no class on February 13th. For those of you who want to, feel free to use that time to complete the midterm online. The midterm is going to be delivered via Blackboard. I am going to open it up on February 13th at 7 a.m. Once I've opened it up, it will be available for you to complete for 48 hours. You can start it at any time within that 48-hour period. Once you've started it, you will have 2 hours to complete it. I am still refining and revising the questions, but we are looking at about 60 questions, no more than 60, and they are all going to be either multiple choice or true false. Our midterm is going to cover chapters 1 through 5 in your textbook and lecture content weeks 2 through 5. It is going to be open book. You can use your notes, lectures, and textbook. I expect that you will do the test independently. Again, you're 4th-year students, so I would hope at this point you're spending less time trying to play the system and instead taking that creative brain power and investing it in your own education and spending that time learning the material. I stressed this in class, and I just want to stress it here. I'm not trying to trick you with any questions. I am not trying to ask you any tiny details that are buried 6 paragraphs deep that you wouldn't have noticed when you were reading. My goal for the midterm is for you to be able to assess your understanding midway through this semester and for me to be able to assess where the class is at. To that end, I'm interested in whether you understand the concepts we've been talking about, the processes we've been talking about, all the pieces that build on each other as you move from evaluation type to evaluation type. So as you're studying, I would suggest focusing on concepts, on processes, that kind of applied piece, and less on tiny details such as what theorist said what in what year. It's not a history course. If you have any questions, reach out to me. And I wish each and every one of you luck. And I will not see you next week. And I will not see you the following week because that's your study week. And so then I will see you the following week. Lastly, I need to present to you your third application assignment. That's because it will be due the Tuesday that we reconvene for class. Since I won't see you next week, and since I won't see you over study week, I want to discuss this now, knowing full well that you won't be submitting this for a while. I would suggest prioritizing studying for your midterm over this and then completing this afterwards. For this application assignment, we're going to shift our approach a little bit this time. I've selected a journal article for you to review, and then there's 3 questions that I want you to attempt to answer. Despite this being a bit more formal, these assignments are still all about trying to take the course content and make the jump into being able to apply it to a real situation. Because the development of outcome measurements is so very vital to impact evaluation and to our foreseeable future in this course, I want to make sure that this piece is focused on a little bit. You don't need to go find this article. I'm going to upload it to Blackboard shortly. And just remember, you have time here. This one isn't due till the week after study break. I just needed to get this information out to you while I still had your attention. So go forward, study, study, study. I'm going to finalize that midterm, and as of Tuesday the 13th, it will be available for you to get it over with. I'll see you guys in a few weeks, and until then, take care.